True.
the top without any problem, including America.
Yes.
Right? And so China is no different. In fact, China probably manifests the extreme of it given the history, the long history, and also the size of China, right? So it is okay. But I think the difference between what we've been seeing over history and now we're seeing is that, in fact, since around 200 years ago, Chinese elites have been trying to reflect upon why we were behind, we were behind the West.
Sure.
And the Western countries were doing really well. And why are we? So a lot of elites were trying to think about ways to rejuvenate the Chinese nation. And the Chinese elites have tried very different experiments, but sometimes it's successful, some are not so successful, and it's just very tumultuous. And then we didn't really have a period of stability to really sit down and really do things right, in particular since the invasion by Japan in the 30s and a big part of the 40s. And then the PRC came. The PRC came and they introduced, or they brought along with them a very different political paradigm. That was really the first time in the Chinese history that political paradigm was introduced to China. Because before that, in most of the history of China is about dynasties. It's ruled by the family, right?
Yeah.
The royal family. And then in a short period of time, it became a republic, right? Republic of China. But PRC rests on the whole idea of socialism, as we discussed earlier. So it's a very different political paradigm. And I think if we look at the results today, since the formation of the PRC, while there were periods of turmoils, the last 40 years, largely speaking, has been quite well, actually. I think if you look deeply into the reasons, it is actually how that paradigm is actually manifesting the advantages of this system, of the approach. But riding on top of what I talked about earlier, the very deep-rooted history, culture, and civilization of China. So the history sort of provides the backdrop. And then there's the modern or new way of political paradigm, which drive China leveraging this backdrop and then learning from the rest of the world, in particular the West, along the way, and then self-improving. And now we are where we are. We are where we are today with this kind of paradigm.
And you also talk a lot about the future, and I love forecasters. I'm a forecaster as well. So I believe it was multipolarism, and you mentioned. But to me, I kept wondering, how is that different than the globalism? Because globalism still was multipolar, right? So can you sort of describe the differences between, say, the end of the globalism and now the new multipolar area, and how is that going to be different?
The globalization that most people now refer to was the period when Thomas Friedman talked about in his book, "The World is Flat."
Sure.
Right. Of course, Thomas Friedman was not the first person to observe that. In our work, much earlier, we already, as business consultants, we've been talking about it. But he codified the term, but it's a very good term. So you can imagine the world being a flat world, right? That was the basic nature of the globalization at that period. I think today is, if people continue to talk about the world as a flat world, I think that people will laugh.
Well, I mean, of course. So, I mean, but the same thing is people's understanding of globalism is that you just, all countries sort of interconnect in a certain way. And so how is multipolarism different than that concept?
There are two forces at work today.
Okay.
There's one force that will continue to connect humanities together, because by definition, human beings would like to be connected, just like you and me and now we're talking.
Yeah.
Why are we talking? Because
we're not going to do a Zoom call. If we're going to do a podcast, we're going to meet in person.
We like to be connected.
Yeah.
Right? So globalization, at that time was very much driven. And also the technology development such as the internet, the mobile phone, and so on, were developed because humans have this tendency to want to be connected. At the same time, we began to see, and now we're still seeing, and perhaps even worse, is that there are forces, or there's a major force that try to divide people, to be divisive, to separate the world into different camps and so
Okay.
on, which I think today is manifesting in the
Oh, I see. So in other words, multipolarism is more about the separation. Whereas
No.
Okay, yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
just
That's
trying
why I'm
to-
trying to get an understanding.
No, I just trying to explain the
Yeah,
two
yeah.
major forces
Oh,
at work
okay,
today
sure.
in
Go
the
ahead.
world. One is the connection.
Yeah.
The other is the divisiveness.
Sure.
And the two are manifesting at the same time.
Okay.
Two are manifesting at the same time. But when I talk about multipolarity,
Yeah.
I think we're getting in the world where, of course, China and the U.S. will continue to be the two leading economic power, or maybe even military power. Right? So that goes without saying. But at the same time, I don't think people can underestimate the role and perhaps the increasing importance of many other countries in the world, in particular countries that are emerging in the global south. I'm talking about countries like India, countries like Brazil,
I see.
Of course, Russia, and of course, Europe will continue to play as well, even though most people will say that Europe is going to perhaps...
As an American, I will withhold judgment.
but I think we should still give a lot of credit to the Europeans who have done a lot of, make a lot of contributions in the last several centuries. And so even countries like, leading countries in the Middle East, like UAE, Saudi, those guys going to, also, provide, a lot of importance in the world. So even superpowers like China and India, when they make decisions on what they want to do, they cannot simply make decisions by themselves. And in fact, they need to consider the inputs from many other of this kind of countries.
Some say we're heading in a direction, not a multipolar, but a bipolar, U.S. side versus China side kind of world. Do you see that as a possible forecast, or is it really going to be really multipolar with different empires?
I think it's, Thomas, I think it's a matter of relativity. I don't think we should go into too much of the jargon. Because by definition, I think the world is going to be much more dynamic, much more complicated than one can easily categorize with a term or one or two or so on. But I think increasingly, the world is in a way becoming more mature. Countries are now understanding where they are and where they want to be, and they're trying to investigate ways that they can modernize themselves. Every major country, I think, is in the process. It's just a matter of degree. And so I think it is too simplistic to use a term one or two to describe where we are today. But I think multipolarity means that the world is pluralistic, that we need to respect very different kind of people, very different kind of culture, and very different kind of country.
I see your point. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but actually a lot of times when I speak to Westerners about China, they tend to focus on the stereotype. Either it's really bad or it's an opportunity. And it's always one extreme or the other. And what I find actually interesting is you're talking a little bit about the balance, and sometimes we get too extreme. How would you like to say, when you're talking to the Western critics of China, and they ask you, what is your definition of China? What do you say to them?
So a lot of people, China is a country. And of course it's a country. But China is more importantly is a civilization. China has grown from relatively small territory, several thousand years ago, to now a pretty vast territory of China. It's not because the Chinese are fundamentally expansionists. It is that culture and civilization expand itself or themselves, in a natural way. As I mentioned earlier already, since more than 2,000 years ago, China has already developed a lot of different schools of thoughts, a lot of different philosophy, a lot of different ways to look at the world and investigate who humanity is, how do we live as a society better. Those kind of thoughts are integrated into a huge civilization. That civilization has a major force of impact, invisible force of impact to many other parts of, at least in Asia, for a long time. And so, I think the way to think about China is a civilization. Why is that important? Because in my book, I talk about the new world of multipolarity, the Chinese investigation into how it can modernize itself and to achieve modernity with Chinese characteristics, by definition, will be rest on the basics of the Chinese civilization. And then through the process of expanding and exporting its ideas to the rest of the world, increasingly other parts of the world will begin to understand what the Chinese civilization is actually all about. And people can make judgment on whether or not that civilization is a good civilization or a bad civilization or whatever. But nonetheless, I see that, is a trend that we're now seeing, is that we are now in a process of a competition for values. Values coming from, of course, from the incumbents in the West, which has been the leaders in the world for several centuries. But now I think the rejuvenation of China, and to some degree, I think we're also seeing some degree of rejuvenation of India, is providing a very different way of thinking about civilization that I think is going to create a more choices to the rest of the world on how they think about their own civilization, their own country should evolve over time against the backdrop of a more choices or more multipolarity in the way of thinking and civilization.
I also think there could be also a rejuvenation of U.S.-China ties when President Trump visits China in April. What are your thoughts about this upcoming trip? Do you think it's going to be positive? Because I've met some Chinese who are very worried about his visit. What's your impression?
I don't know. I'm not a political analyst.
That's okay, but I mean, like, just from a businessman's perspective, as a Chinese business consultant, with Trump coming to China, do you think it's going to be a positive, or could it be a situation where maybe the conflict erupts even more?
I work with a lot of business leaders on both sides. So a lot, of course, in China, but also I work a lot with multinational business leaders, including in particular American business leaders. My sense over the years is that there's a lot of shared interest by business leaders to really want to create value for themselves and together with their partners. And so in general, given the rapid development of the Chinese economy, the market development, and also now being a source of innovations and so on, the gravitation towards China from Western business leaders, in particular American business, is actually very strong. They want to be part of China. They want to use China, of course, as a market, but also use it as a source of inspirations, innovation, and technology development, and so on and so forth. And so I think the common interest, at least in the business world, is much, much higher than what's being talked about in the political circles. I think in politics, people tend to talk about differences.
Sure.
But in business, I see that people tend to talk about common interest, regardless of national borders.
But maybe we have a scenario similar to Nixon, when Nixon visited China, because Nixon was very anti-China. He was a Cold Warrior, and he came to China and said, let's talk to the Chinese. And now Trump's reputation, as we know, was very anti-China. So if all of a sudden he says China and U.S. partnership for peace and prosperity for our world, I think actually many of us followers, and I support Trump, but I'm also supportive of China. But I mean, I'm different than most pro-Trump people. But isn't it possible that Trump may be the kind of person who will actually inspire many Americans to become more supportive of China if he has a wonderful trip to China in April?
I really won't have any specific predictions on this specific trip, and also by President Trump himself. But as I mentioned, I think the common interest actually is quite overwhelming, and I believe that China actually can add a lot of value to how American economy will be developing, and vice versa. Of course, Americans can also help China.
But there's always going to be suspicions, like, for example, the issues of data collection. And I mean, I was in China during the COVID crackdown, and it was hard. I mean, I don't know anyone, I mean, if they say something positive, to be honest, I don't know why. It was a hard time. And actually, one of the things that it wakes up is that the digital currency can be controlled. So how do we address that issue? Because many people who want to do business in China, they worry about these issues of digital surveillance and then the control of their money. What do you say to these people who are very suspicious of that?
Oh, everything have two sides of the coin.
That's okay, right? Yeah.
You know, everything, even, you know, I think when we first have an automobile, and then of course, then you begin to have regulations on how people or pedestrians can walk on the streets. Before that, you know, if it's only, you know, the horse carts, you don't need any. You didn't need any regulation policies. So, you know, when new things came up and people were suspicious, and then some people would criticize, and then very quickly people would adapt to the situation. I think on this issue about so-called digital surveillance and so on, of course, you know, some people would say, wow, then maybe I lose my freedom and so on. But I think the other side, you know, Thomas, since you live in China, you know how China has been changing over the years, over the last, let's say the last 10 years. And today, you know, I'm sure you would agree that when you leave even valuable stuff outside.
True. It's safe here.
Nobody's gonna pick it up, right? In theory, I think even if you don't lock your door when you sleep at night, nobody's gonna question.
I'm not gonna take that chance though.
Well, in theory, that's what I mean. That's what I mean. Is it good or bad? It's a matter of your judgment, right? But I think China has proved to a lot of people, including its own people, that this so-called surveillance actually could help with the living conditions of the Chinese people, including, I think we're now, you know, in Beijing. 10 years ago, Beijing was highly polluted. Today is almost, you know, blue skies and very clean. How did that happen? It actually requires a lot of surveillance technology. You survey what's going on. You know, you take measurements of the, you know, the air pollution and what it is, and so on and so forth. So is it good or bad? It depends on your perspective. But I personally believe that, you know, China is a very changed society in a very short period of time because of technology, in particular this so-called surveillance technology.
And definitely we're having a fascinating conversation, but I always end on a final question, which is, do you have any final thoughts for our viewers? Anything else that you think was unsaid that you can say now?
Well, I think fundamentally is the theme that we've been talking about, that when people talk about China, people tend to talk about China in the tangible and observable aspects of China that they can relate to and they can understand. So basically, the people talk about the political system today, and they talk about the size of China, the fact that, you know, there are many STEM students in China, the fact that there are a lot of IP patents, the fact that Chinese leaders are mostly engineers and not lawyers, like for some people, like in America, that kind of stuff. And some people will say, oh, the Chinese have a long-term view, they have a long-term strategy. All those reasons to try to explain why China has been growing in the last several decades, they are not necessarily incorrect, but they are not sufficient. They don't really drive deeply into the fundamental reasons why China has been growing and exhibiting its high level of resilience over this period of time, and probably for a very long time to come. And that's going back to the roots of what I talk about, is how China's long history, its very rich culture and very rich civilization are providing a backdrop. I'm not talking about the Chinese civilization that's always very, very good. In fact, in many periods of our history, it was quite tumultuous, but there are also periods of our history which are really brilliant. But I think the Chinese have much more data to rely upon. And when they study the data, they will say, we didn't do well here, and we have done well here. And now today, when we try to do better, let's prevent the mistakes again. Let's try to do things in a better way. I think that's so important because, in my view, that provides such a backdrop for the long-term resilience of Chinese growth. And the Chinese growth is not only about Chinese growth. It is that dissemination of the Chinese way of thinking and the Chinese values to many other parts of the world that I think we're beginning to see. And that will come, actually. So if we measure this, let's say we leave now and then we come back in 100 years from now, a century later, I think that will be a very different world.
Yeah.
And I think one can imagine how the world will look like, where China will be, where the West will be, and maybe many other countries in the so-called multipolar world will become, how the world will look like at that time. Yeah. That would be very interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. And driving deeper into the reasons is exactly why I have Thomas chats with we're trying to get a better understanding of our world in a deeper level. And a lot of times when I speak to people, I want to know what their real thinking is. And I was happy to talk with Ed Shea today because he is really an expert on China, but he also really gave a deeper level explanation on China and why China is what it is. So thank you for joining and having Thomas today.
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.